This is Dr. Devon Price. I'm a social psychologist. I'm a proud autistic person. I'm a clinical associate professor at Loyola University Chicago, and I'm the author of the books Unmasking for Life, Unmasking Autism, Laziness Does Not Exist, and Learning Shame. And for today's address, I'm going to be speaking to everyone about the present state of autistic self-advocacy, some of the major gains that we've seen as a movement and even as a scientific community in terms of understanding and acceptance of autism over the last couple of years. And I'm also going to talk about what some of the major pain points and challenges are that we are seeming to be facing as these changes and this progress is being made, some of the political attacks that we're under and what those mean, and what a potential route forward might look like for all of us. So I'm going to share my screen here and pull up my slides and talk everybody through this presentation. So a lot of this presentation is inspired in part by my most recent book, Unmasking for Life, which is really all about autistic people finding the strength, the self-advocacy skills, and the community support, as well as the social, economic, and political resources that we need to be able to thrive as our unmasked selves. Because it's not enough for us to simply accept that we are autistic or to even feel like disability is a good, beneficial thing. All of that unlearning of ableist stigma and the pride that we work on and things like that are really beneficial. But there's also the social conditions in the world that make it really hard for us to unmask or to live comfortably and at peace as ourselves. And we really have to look at a lot of those pieces as well. So as I mentioned, I am an autistic author. I need to update my author photo a little bit. This one's from a couple of years ago. But my most relevant books to what we're talking about today are Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity, which came out in 2022, and then the follow-up book to it, Unmasking for Life, The Autistic Person's Guide to Connecting, Loving, and Living Authentically, which came out last year in 2025. My books are just part of a general tideswell of books written by autistic authors speaking to the autistic experience. This alone is a huge demonstration of the progress that we've made as a community in the last several years. It used to be that if we were lucky, we would get a book like Steve Silberman's Neurotribes, which was written by a non-autistic person who nonetheless was interested in this idea that autistic people were simply different and a diverse population that belong within the greater thread of humanity, and arguing for our acceptance. But now we can argue for our own acceptance and speak to our own experiences, and there is really a large audience for it, and even the publishing industry, which can be really slow to move and pretty conservative, is seeing that this conversation is worth having. So we have amazing books like We're Not Broken by Eric Garcia, Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker, Empire of Normality by Robert Chapman, Uncomfortable Labels, My Life as a Gay Autistic Trans Woman by Laura Kate Dale, and I Overcame My Autism and All I Got Was This Lousy Anxiety Disorder by Sarah Kerchak. And there have been many more, even since the release of these. The conversation about autism has really moved forward significantly, where we are allowed to tell our own stories and be seen as authorities on our experience, and there's really a large market for it, which not just economically but socially means that people who aren't us are actually curious about us, and also that we're growing in numbers every day. Far and far more of us are getting diagnosed or self-realizing as autistic and seeking out resources like these. So we've seen major steps forward in autism acceptance in the last couple of years. There is a really expanded public understanding of what autism is. When I compare it to 10 years ago, when I was initially coming out as autistic to some of my loved ones, it's no longer seen as bad news. A lot of people present autism as a positive now, and it's not shied away from as much. And a lot more people are on board with the basic ideas of neurodiversity, holding that people are built differently and that autism is itself a incredibly diverse neurotype. We've seen major gains in terms of gestures at inclusion of autistic people in the workplace, and diversity and inclusion initiatives at work, either being devoted to disabled or neurodivergent populations or including conversations about neurodivergence, though I'll definitely touch on some limitations with that as well. There is a lot of social and even in the literature resistance to the medicalized deficit-based paradigm of autism. And we are seeing, even in terms of existing treatment structures and resources available, that people are more interested in at least examining liberatory models of accessibility and care rather than treating autism as something to be cured or corrected. That really we are seeing more and more as a marginalized population that deserves resources and accommodation rather than a cure. Part of the expanded public understanding of autism comes from the improvement, relatively speaking, in how we are depicted in the media. Through social media, a lot of people had their first exposure to autistic adults talking about what it actually feels like to be autistic. Sesame Street had a nonverbal autistic Muppet, and initially they were looking into working with groups with ASAN, like ASAN, the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, though unfortunately they did end up working instead with Autism Speaks, which is a lot more reactionary and a lot more based on a deficit paradigm. Shows like Love on the Spectrum have made autism a subject of curiosity and even empathy for a really wide and general audience of people. Again, to the point now where a lot of people don't see autism as inherently a negative label, even for their kids when they're diagnosed, or if they meet an autistic new friend or colleague. An increasing number of autistic celebrities have started coming out about their neurotype. Every time I revisit this topic, there's someone new. The most recent one that I've seen is the actor Tom Hardy, who, of course, played Bane in the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, among many, many other things. He was in Venom. He was in so many wonderful movies. The comedian Ron Funches, he was diagnosed as autistic on the set of the British reality TV show The Traitors after having a really hard time adjusting there to some of the pressures and stresses of that work. And this actor from The Last of Us also came out, Bella Ramsey, a few years ago as both non binary and neurodivergent. This has led to some really significant gains, I think, for us as a community. There is greater appreciation among the public for the fact that autism can look a bunch of different ways and that autism can be present in underrepresented communities, such as women, trans people, older people, people of color, especially Black people. And there's a greater understanding now that autism can be masked, that you can't necessarily tell from looking at someone whether they are autistic, and that many of us who belong in these underrepresented groups are really likely to be masking some of our biggest struggles. The overall public attitude toward autism has made really massive gains. It's no longer seen as a death sentence to your marriage or your family when a child is diagnosed. There is much more interest in having autistics in the workplace from the perspective of employers and educators, and just in the discourse, in the public conversation, people speak about autism in a more positive and friendly way. There's less fear among parents and educators about a child being autistic. We see less label avoidance, so families don't shy away from getting their children diagnosed quite as much, which used to be a really big problem, especially for people of my generation, autistics who were coming up in the 90s. And prior to that, it was even worse. A lot of families avoided even seeking a diagnosis because they feared the stigma of autism so much. For autistic people ourselves, there's much greater access to finding the resources that will help us understand ourselves, whether that's beginning with a search on TikTok or Instagram Reels, or in my case, Tumblr back in 2014, to finding resources online like the Autistic Self Advocacy Network or realsocialskills.org, different forums, Reddits and subreddit threads, private communities and Discord servers, blogs run by autistic people with executive functioning tips and medical self-advocacy tips. There's the Neurodivergent Therapists Directory, which is at ndtherapists.org. It's just much easier for neurodivergent people to learn about themselves and access resources that are going to help them rather than pathologize them compared to a few years ago. And we do have access to higher quality research and more community-driven research. Even back when I was writing Unmasking Autism in 2021, there was a real dearth of research that involved any autistic researchers in it. And there was very little research that included any self-diagnosed or self-realized autistics in the sample. And even since then, 5 years ago, we've seen a massive jump. When I was beginning to research for the follow up book, Unmasking for Life, I could find so many resources that included autistic researchers, or where both diagnosed and self diagnosed autistics were included in the study, seen as legitimate, and compared. And so we know a lot more now about adult, masked, and self realized autistic populations, thanks to that huge wellspring of research that's really come out in the last couple of years. And surprise, surprise, what we found is that there's very little to distinguish diagnosed autistics from self realized autistics. So it's really exciting to have research backing a lot of that up. There are, however, a lot of challenges and limitations to these gains. Even though more and more people understand that autism is not solely a visible disability that exists among, let's say, the age old stereotype of young white men who with kind of masculine special interests, the face of kind of late realized or masked autism that much of the public is faced with is still incorrect and limited. So we see a lot of representation of white cisgender women who are autistic, who are kind of the portrait of late in life autistic realization, masked autism, ADHD, and some of these communities. And it tends to be those among us with kind of the most privilege and kind of the most conveniently sympathetic story that ends up getting centered. There tends to be still quite a focus on our strengths as a community and whether we are respectable. So if you look at autism as it's discussed on social media, you'll see, again, a lot of white cisgender women saying, I'm not that stereotype of what you were told autism is. I'm actually incredibly empathic. I'm actually incredibly social and sensitive. I'm really skillful socially, in fact, thanks to years of masking. And this strengths-based framing can veer into respectability politics, where the only autistics that are viewed as acceptable to talk about are the ones who are quite similar to the demands of neurotypical society. Autistic people who are capable of moving through neurotypical society. And that might be at extreme cost to themselves, but they still have the option to do it. And because they are cisgender, because they're white, because they're seen as non-threatening in various ways, they are a portrait of disability that many people are sympathetic to. And that does not necessarily leave room for autistics with high support needs, those of us who don't have a social drive, those of us who don't have empathy, those of us who do have frightening meltdowns, those of us who aren't non-threatening because we might be darker skinned or non-white or not cis women. And that can cause a lot of limitations to our gains as a community. If the only autistics that are really being accepted are those that are seen as very pleasant to be around and socially skillful, then that means a lot of us get left in the lurch, including anyone who's just more likely to be stereotyped as threatening because of something like their race or their body size, or how their autism presents. We also have to take care not to leave other neurodivergent people in the lurch. Sometimes I see neurodivergent people contrasting themselves, specifically autistic people contrasting themselves with people with borderline personality disorder, for instance, or people with bipolar, or people with OCD or narcissistic personality disorder. And if we're really buying into the project of neurodiversity, that people are just born different and that they need to be accepted, and that even if a person has life experiences that kind of change their psychology, they deserve accommodation, we really need to be 10 toes down and stand by that for everyone, including the neurodivergent people who society still sees as a little bit more scary or stigmatized. Unfortunately, for a lot of autistic people who are first learning about their disability on the internet, there is often this push to find positive depictions of autism that can kind of flatten the diversity of our community. So, narratives that autism is a superpower can really quickly veer into supremacist narratives that leave behind the autistic people for whom their disability could not ever be felt as a superpower. So if you have self-injurious stims, if you elope and wander around and get lost and need help wayfinding, if you can't bathe or toilet yourself, if you have really severe sensory issues, That is a true experience for a lot of autistic people that makes being autistic really difficult. And those narratives are just as important to hold and give political and social space to as the stories of some of us who are later in life diagnoses or later in life self diagnosis and come out the gate with a ton of autistic pride, speaking only about the positives of autism, when really it's okay to have a negative or mixed experience of being a disabled person in the world, because that's just what happens. There are aspects of being autistic in the world that are just really difficult and unpleasant, no matter how proud you are of your disability. So it's really important for us as a community to not censor that out, even as we're trying to push for greater acceptance. We have to hold space for the negative side of things and make sure that our acceptance is not predicated on us just being happy and smiley and easy to be around all the time. There's also a risk of neurodiversity losing some of its political focus. So, the neurodiversity movement is a liberationist movement that is highly critical of psychiatry and the medical industrial complex. It's critical of white supremacy, it's critical of colonization, and it is a group project, right? It is an effort to change some of the social, medical, political systems that make life difficult for us. And if we as a community focus instead on individual pride and telling our individual stories of autism and making a lot of money off of that via, say, social media, then we might be leaving behind that community aspect that is what got us to this place in the first place. Some of the ways we can resolve these tensions are by centering the autistics who've been left behind, the non speaking, the intellectually disabled, the visibly autistic, who cannot mask. Make sure to keep our messaging focused on the importance of dignity and autonomy, not on ability. So, again, ensuring that all autistic people have dignified lives where they have freedom to live as they see fit, regardless of how much support they need. We have to make sure that we resist respectability. So we need to challenge assumptions about what makes a person valuable. An autistic person who doesn't have empathy is just as valuable and human of an autistic person as a hyper empathetic, highly sensitive autistic person. We have to stand in solidarity with other heavily stigmatized neurodivergent groups, because anything negative that people could say about those groups, they could say about us. So, narcissistic folks, borderline folks, people with severe intellectual disabilities, people with high support needs, abuse survivors whose ways of coping with abuse might be a little messy, PTSD sufferers, autistics who are in prison, autistics who are unpleasant to be around. We have to stand with all of them because they all suffer from stigma and exclusion, and they all deal with the same access issues that autistic people struggle with. We also have to focus on the delivery of material supports. Every autistic person benefits, every person in society benefits, frankly, when we have housing, basic income, health insurance, and so on. Another major area of gains for autistic people has been in the area of workplace acceptance and diversity and inclusion initiatives at work. These are just some of the places where I've been asked to give talks about neurodiversity: Nike, Indeed, Liberty Mutual, Carnegie Mellon, Etsy, Reverb, Yahoo. The list goes on and on. And every week, pretty much, I'm getting more invitations to speak to large corporations and universities about neurodiversity. We've also seen major gains in just interest in employee resource groups for neurodivergent employees. This is a statistic from my book, Unmasking for Life. Today, approximately 40% of companies have employee resource groups, increasing at a rate of about 9% per year. In 2021, 70% of companies who had employee diversity-based resource groups rolled out new initiatives, and the most popular kind of new employee affinity group was a neurodiversity-focused group. So there is a huge trend towards workplaces inviting people like me to give talks, forming workplace affinity groups for neurodivergent employees, and even trying to recruit neurodivergent employees. This means there's been some real legitimate workplace gains for the neurodivergent worker. There's greater visibility of neurodivergent people in the workplace. There's more targeted recruitment of neurodivergent workers, which can potentially help close employment gaps, neurodivergent people being famously really underemployed at a rate of something like 80 to 85% unemployment among autistic adults. When there are neurodiversity focused employee affinity or resource groups, that gives neurodivergent people in the workplace the opportunity to find and connect with one another, which gives them the chance to organize together and push for collective change, to find community, to feel less alone, and to even change the cultures of their workplaces. There's also a lot of opportunities for these groups to collaborate with other affinity groups. So, Black and Brown employee resource groups, women and trans groups, queer groups, and so on, because often a lot of our needs are overlapping. And typically, if a workplace is discriminatory against one group of us, it's probably discriminating against the rest of us, and there's strength in numbers. So, all of this can be quite promising to see. However, there's a lot of challenges that come with this new narrative that neurodivergent people can be an asset in the workplace. First is that increased visibility is also vulnerability. I cite statistics in both of my books about autism showing that around 50% of autistic people who come out as neurodivergent at work go on to regret it, either because they feel that they're being treated differently or they didn't get any tangible benefits. So it just doesn't really feel like it was worthwhile for them to risk exposure and potentially be seen differently in return for nothing. A lot of institutions talk the talk but don't walk the walk. So they'll bring in a speaker like me or form a neurodiversity pride group or have an event, but they won't actually change the fluorescent lights in their building. They won't actually give people more work from home options or some of the other accommodations that neurodivergent employees genuinely need. So there might be a lot of talking about including neurodivergent folks, but not much of actually doing it. We're currently living in an environment, especially in the United States, of increased political attacks on diversity initiatives at work. Any publicly funded institution basically isn't allowed to have diversity initiatives in the workplace. So that's a big issue. Sometimes those of us who are out at work are treated as tokens or symbols. So our employer will put us on a brochure or list us in their diversity statistics. But the second that we have a meltdown or have a communication problem with a colleague, we are seen as the problem and we're the first to go. One of the reasons that autistics are being recruited in the workplace in such high numbers also is because we are seen as a readily exploitable resource. Again, I cite some citations about this in my book, Unmasking for Life, but typically it is when companies are having recruitment problems that they start turning to recruiting neurodivergent employees. I cite one really frightening statistic that shows that actually when companies are starting to deal with workers unionizing and the companies want to resist that, that's when they start recruiting autistic employees. And the reason for that is we are desperate for work, most of us. As I already mentioned, autistics are typically underemployed and unemployed at really high rates. So workplaces know this and they have a sense that we are going to be easier to exploit because we're so desperate for jobs that we will commit as many hours as necessary to the workplace, that we won't complain, and that we'll be so thankful to even have a job that we'll let our employers mistreat us. And unfortunately, this is a big element of why in certain industries, neurodivergent employees are being recruited so doggedly. It's because we're seen as really hard workers who will not complain and who will not unionize. There's also limitations to what things like workplace affinity groups or ERGs are capable of advocating for. These groups are created by the employer, they are funded by the employer, and every single thing that they do is viewed over and reviewed and approved by the employer. So if you're going to be doing anything like trying to change the structure of the workplace, get people raises, more benefits, anything that's going to cost your employer something in real terms, generally speaking, your employer is not going to let you do that through an employee resource group. And so you have to turn to something more like a union where you have collective power to bargain with your employer rather than ask politely for their approval, which is typically what happens for these DEI and ERG groups. Some of the ways to resolve these tensions are to take the workplace organizing outside of the auspices of your employer. So get away from the employee resource groups after you've used them to find some of your peers, and then really start thinking about and talking about collective bargaining. Organize your workplace. Talk to members of other groups. Talk to your Black employee group. Talk to your Latinx employee group. Talk to the other disabled employees, the women, the trans people, the queer people. Ask them what is bothering them about the workplace too, and see if off of site, out of view of your bosses, you can have conversations about things like making a collective demand for those issues to be resolved. What we see in the data is that unionized workplaces are workplaces that are better for disabled employees. This is a citation from my book. This is a quote from my book, Unmasking for Life. A report by the IZA Institute of Labor Economics found that disabled workers at unionized companies were less likely to be fired, and they experienced a 29.8% wage premium compared to disabled workers at companies without unions. The Institute also found that unionized companies were more adept at responding to accessibility requests. The Center for Economic Policy Research similarly finds that unionized workplaces are better at identifying and addressing pay gaps between non-disabled employees and disabled employees. When you look at companies that have DEI groups or employee resource groups that are sponsored by the employer, you don't see these same benefits. So while these workplace affinity groups and DEI initiatives can be a great start of the conversation in terms of finding some visibility and locating other coworkers who are disabled like you, and they can even help you get a job, that's really just the first step for us as a community. After that, we really have to look into organizing together to really demand better and more equitable treatment in the workplace. Another area where we've seen massive gains as a community is resistance to the medicalized framework, the understanding of autism as this horrible pathology that needs to be either treated or cured. Many autism researchers now accept self-identified autistic adults within their subject pool. Within the peer-reviewed journal Autism in Adulthood, self-realized autistics make up the bulk of the participant sample in many studies. And in many of those studies comparing self-diagnosed autistics to diagnosed autistics, researchers have repeatedly found that self-realized autistics or self-diagnosed autistics are indistinguishable from their diagnosed peers. So our experiences are very similar. Our autism severity, quote unquote, is quite similar. A growing body of research now considers it acceptable to include autism spectrum traits as qualifying for inclusion in autism studies. So again, it's not just the formally autistic diagnosed autistic kid. It might also be their autism spectrum parents, grandparents, neighbors, and classmates that can be included in research, which really diversifies our sample and helps us understand the true spread of autism a lot more. This is all, this writing, by the way, is all from a piece of mine called Self-Identification is the Future of Autism Assessment. And that is at my Substack, drdevonprice.substack.com, if you want to read more about that. What some of these gains mean is that there's greater personal control over our identities. More and more autistic spaces accept and celebrate self-realized people. That means autistic people get to decide how we identify on our own terms. Because it's possible now to find autistic community without a formal diagnosis, there's a lot more diversity within the autistic community. Underrepresented groups such as Black men and women and non-binary people, trans people, women, older people, and people who mask are now able to join the community, say that they know that they belong, and really be believed, which means we have more autistic people out there advocating for ourselves and a greater diversity of us. There's greater understanding among medical providers and researchers about autism, and there's greater acceptance of self-realization. Where I've seen this the most is among therapists. Again, we have the Neurodivergent Therapists directory at ndtherapists.org, where a ton of self-realized therapists, autistic therapists, are available looking for autistic clients, and ADHD therapists are looking for ADHD clients. And increasingly, you can find a therapist or even a doctor who will believe you if you tell them, I'm autistic and I'm not formally diagnosed, but I know this to be true. It can still be challenging in many places, but there have been massive gains in that area. This also reflects broadly a change in how providers are conceptualizing autism. Researchers, doctors, therapists, and care teams are beginning to see autism as a really common and completely neutral source of human diversity. It's neither good nor bad, it's just something that happens, and it's part of who we are, and it's something that you can expect to see walking through your clinic door. There's also been major political gains in terms of autistic representation. More people are able to find their community in much the same way that trans people have kind of existed in this post trans tipping point state, which kind of happened around 2015, 2016, where suddenly there were trans people in the media and people knew what being trans meant. And it was easier than ever for parents to find resources for their trans kids and for trans people to find community within their own cities and doctors who would believe them and help them. Autism is going through much the same renaissance where because there's been such a loud collective push for change and so many of us have been so vocal about our experiences, the culture is catching up and people are aware of us in greater numbers than ever before. There are, however, challenges that come with this. There are still a lot of providers that are skeptical of self-realization and unfortunately believe that self-diagnosed autistics are just looking for attention or that the only authority that ever really matters is a clinic's authority, a clinician's authority. Because there's so much information about autism available online that comes from just random autistic people taking to the internet, that means it can be really difficult to vet the quality of information that's available. So just about anyone can get online and talk about their autistic experience, and just because their experience is valid doesn't mean that it's going to apply to everyone. So there can be a lot of misinformation or sometimes oversimplification of the autistic experience. Because there's been these huge gains in self-realization and self-diagnosed autistics really coming to the fore, it just tends to be the case that those of us who are self-realized or late in life realized, the only reason that we were able to get to that point is because our autism was typically less visible and that we were less visibly disabled than our peers who did get diagnosed. And so that means that we can sometimes kind of drown out our more support needing and nonverbal peers in the conversation, which doesn't do us as a community any service. There's still a relative lack of access to resources for just about everyone. There are not enough clinicians who are actually respectful. There are not enough school psychologists who are actually respectful. There's not enough money to go around. There's not enough social welfare resources or doctor's appointments. And as more and more people realize they're autistic, that has not necessarily changed. There's also a ton of political attacks on diagnosed autistics. There's RFK Jr. in the corner here in the United States, a massive threat to autistic lives with his threats of creating a public autism registry, which could be used for who knows what purpose. There's a lot of limits on the types of care and the types of political freedoms that diagnosed autistic people have. So, for instance, if you are diagnosed as autistic, you can be denied a ICU bed or a ventilator. You can be denied custody of your children. In many countries, if you're diagnosed autistic, you can be denied refugee or immigrant status. And so, even though a lot more people are realizing that they're autistic and seeking out a formal autism diagnosis, sometimes that comes with more risks than it does benefits. So, that's really important to be cognizant of. Here are just some of the potential negative consequences of being diagnosed as autistic. This is from a piece I wrote on Substack called Seeking an Autism Diagnosis. Here's why you might want to rethink that. As I already mentioned, you can be banned from immigrating, turned away as a refugee, taken off organ donation lists, taken out of a ventilator or ICU bed, denied child custody, forcibly placed on a financial conservatorship, banned from accessing gender-affirming care, or even forced into a mental institution if you have a formal autism diagnosis on your record. And this is true in the United States, but it's true in many, many other countries throughout the world. So how do we resolve these tensions as a community? First, we really need to continue pushing for providers to support client self-realization. If your therapist and your doctor will believe you when you tell them that you have, let's say, sensory needs, then you don't have to seek out a diagnosis that might put you on an autism registry that you don't want to be on, or that it could be risky for you to be on. Generally speaking, we can learn from the informed consent model, which is what many trans people in the United States use to access care. The idea being that you, as the individual, are the expert on your experience, and the role of a provider is to simply tell you what your options are, educate you, and get your informed consent to anything that you decide to proceed with. So we should move toward a more collaborative and empowering form of providing care where providers make information and resources available to their patients and clients, but let the process be patient directed. In some cases, particularly in the US, providers are already doing this. They're undiagnosing patients. So if a patient is worried about ending up on an autism registry, they are removing that autism diagnosis from their record and instead replacing it with something like sensory processing disorder, a migraine disorder, a adjustment disorder in some cases, in some therapeutic practices, something that is less likely to be really stigmatizing and used against them. It's important for us as a community to continue to push for this understanding of neurodivergence as a status as a politically disenfranchised group. We're not a group of people with a coherent disorder. There's not something biologically, quote unquote, wrong with us that a medical provider can see on a brain scan or in a blood test or even from giving us a survey. We are a group of people who are systematically excluded from work, housing, schooling, medical care, legal supports, and a variety of other social structures because we're seen as different and lesser. And our strength comes from fighting to be seen as deserving of the same legal protections that any discriminated against group receives. We can also really push for alternatives to formal diagnosis for those autistic adults who need resources but are worried about stigma. So, again, something like a nonverbal learning disorder diagnosis, sensory processing disorder, adjustment disorder, etc., tends to be something that will allow you to get approval for accommodations at school or work, therapy to be covered by insurance, etc., without necessarily having this mark on your chart that could be used against you forever in some of these frightening ways. Another area where we've seen really massive gains lately is a move toward more liberatory models of accessibility and care. So, support groups for neurodivergent people, care that is led by neurodivergent therapists and providers, collaborative care, um, alternatives to schooling where neurodivergent kids can learn at home or learn at their own pace instead of being forced to operate on a neurotypical educational pace. And then there's even amazing legal gains like supportive decision making, where instead of losing your right to make your own decisions because you're disabled, you can be assigned or you can choose someone in your life to help you make decisions. So, for example, if you have intellectual disabilities, you might select a parent, a friend, a family friend, a trusted care provider, a beloved teacher that's been in your life for years, someone else that you trust to help you understand medical decisions, legal decisions, to help you go through the difficulty of signing up for a rental apartment, etc., etc. And this is a really fabulous legal paradigm that exists in, I think, now 14 or 15 states in the United States. That instead of placing someone on a conservatorship when they need support, they can instead appoint a person to help them make decisions. These kinds of changes have led to massive gains. Again, we've replaced the more punitive guardianships and conservatorships with just supported decision making in, goodness, I had the number underestimated, 20 states. So instead of losing all your legal rights, potentially forever, neurodivergent and disabled people who need support can choose who they want to represent them. Children who are neurodivergent and learn differently can benefit from unschooling or homeschooling that's done in a neurodivergent affirming way. And educational institutions now more and more understand that child directed learning is much more effective. That when you listen to what a child wants, what motivates them, and what they need, and you honor their body autonomy, they have better educational outcomes. There's a rise of peer support groups There's autistic coaches, autistic peer coaches as an alternative to therapy, where an autistic person who, let's say, needs help unmasking or just adjusting to a difficult portion of life can just seek out another neurodivergent person to walk them through that. We also see more and more visibility and support for groups that are by us and for us, like the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, Autistics Against Curing Autism, the Autism Society, and the list really goes on and on. There's so many large and small autistic groups, both in terms of being formal nonprofits and just small community groups. There's so many autistic groups that you can find on Discord, Meetup, Reddit, Eventbrite, local community groups, local friend groups, and political advocacy groups, mutual aid groups by neurodivergent people. The list really goes on and on. There are, however, again, more challenges that come with the moment that we're in and what our gains have looked like. So there's still a relative lack of access to resources for autistic people to be educated on our own terms, to receive therapy that helps us thrive on our own terms rather than replicate a neurotypical person's version of life. It's still really hard for us to find affirming and safe medical care, and we still struggle to live independently. Most of us do not hold down full time jobs. Most of us cannot, even if we do get a full time job, hold it down forever, as there's a really heightened risk of burnout for us. And we often need alternative supports in terms of forming families and finding a way to live where we can get all of our resource needs met. We can eat, we can buy video games and books and clothes and furniture. We can form families, we can form relationships. It's really difficult for us to do that under the current very individualistic and isolated society that we're living in. There's still a huge shortage of medical providers, therapists, and so on, especially ones that are neurodiversity affirming. Many of us exist in a state of extreme isolation. So, this is kind of the downside to something like the gains in homeschooling for autistics. On the one hand, if your major schooling institution that's available in your community is not accessible to you as a autistic kid, it might be a great thing that you have the option to learn from home where you can control the temperature, the lighting, the pace, and you can move your body however you want and wear whatever you want. However, if your only option for learning is to be away from any other people, you're kind of at the behest of your parents, which means that autistic people right now, whether they have a positive outcome as children, is really highly dependent on whether they were lucky enough to be born into a family that isn't abusive and that is willing to put in the work to learn about them and their needs. And so it's not quite a fair distribution of access to resources. There's also still a real lack of access and options for adult autistics who continue to need support. What do we do about the level 2 autistics who need a ton of support navigating the world, but also might crave a ton of independence? Right now, for a lot of autistic people, the only choices are to be dependent on family or a institution and to live in an institution in some way, or to be completely dependent on a family member, or to try and go it on your own, where you might end up being homeless, or you might end up getting into a marriage and being reliant upon a spouse to financially cover you. And these are really limiting options that are part of why, as a community, we're at a really heightened risk of abuse. So, what we really need to see is more support in terms of unemployment coverage, housing coverage, access to medical care, and so on for adult autistics, so that even those of us who can't work a full time job can still live in dignity and have enough control over our own lives that we don't get abused and mistreated. I talk about this a ton in my book, Unmasking for Life, but right now, a lot of autistic people are unfortunately forced to build their own accessibility tools and build their own support network. There are a lot of inspiring stories in the book of this, of autistic people who all live together in a polyamorous polycule or a commune of some kind where 4 or 5 disabled people all take care of each other and pool money and cover each other's needs. And sometimes there are really beautiful alternative ways of living that some autistic people have found for themselves, whether that's living in a ensuite or an in-law suite on a family member's property, or living in a trailer or a car, because then it's a lot cheaper and they have more independence. But the sad reality is that autistic people are doing these really creative and paradigm busting things right now out of necessity, not out of joy. And we need to give autistic people the ability to live, and all disabled people the ability to live in dignity, with freedom over their bodies, with the ability to make friends and pursue their passions, and to feel okay in themselves, regardless of whether they can afford to work or not, whether they have the ability to work or live independently or not. We can resolve some of these tensions by investing more in training for providers. We can invest in social services such as welfare, disability coverage, health insurance coverage, and so on. We can really uplift a lot of grassroots and community-run service organizations, especially ones done by and for autistic people. We can make it easier to access these supports. So if there were ways to access things like disability insurance without having a really difficult to secure autism diagnosis, then that means more of us would get support earlier instead of tumbling into poverty or abuse or deprivation. Another thing that's really powerful is for us to collectively get more people on board with the idea that capitalism is part of what disables us. When you are expected to be a completely independent individual who is solely in charge of your housing, your food, your child rearing, the cleanliness of your home, clothing yourself, your medical care, all of these responsibilities. When we look historically, people have not been able to cover all of these demands by themselves. They usually either had some kind of community support, or they had servants, or they had a wife to cover these things for them. Independent living, as it's called, has always been built upon a bed of someone else being exploited, whether that was a servant or an enslaved person or a wife, or off of the profits of people who make less money than you. Generally speaking, we have all needed support. And when we can live in a more community oriented way, and when people recognize that true, full, working independence under capitalism is actually impossible for everyone, then I think we might see some real gains in terms of giving support to those of us with disabilities. Because ultimately, we all enter the kingdom of the disabled, as Susan Sontag once wrote. If we live long enough, we're not going to be that beautiful independent worker bee that society demands we be. So why don't we plan for something different? As I've already mentioned numerous times in this presentation, autistics are really at risk systematically. 80 to 85% of us are unemployed. 75% of us have experienced domestic violence, either at the hand of a partner, a family member, or a roommate. 48% of us experience anxiety at clinical levels. 31% of us experience a mood disorder such as depression or bipolar. 60% of us have some kind of trauma and lingering traumatic symptoms. And among us, suicide is one of the leading causes of death because we often don't see a way forward to be comfortable and accepted in society. And there are so many barriers and challenges working against us. So it's really important as we make major political and social gains in terms of public awareness and in terms even of our own acceptance of our autistic selves to remember that we need to do something about this. We need to demand that society does something about this because they have been neglecting us this entire time. The solution, I think, to many of these major problems and challenges is for autistics, ADHDers, bipolar people, borderline people, all neurodivergent folks to be meaningfully socially integrated on all levels of society to a degree that society actually changes itself. Support financially for those who cannot work or do not work, without question. Believing as a society that no one deserves to be unhoused and starving, no matter their life story. We need to push for public acceptance of some of those more stigmatized autistic traits that get many of us stared at, fired, get the cops called on us, and all of these other horrible outcomes that leave us at such a state of disadvantage. So, greater public acceptance of stimming, echolalia, meltdowns, shutdowns, using an AAC to communicate, having relationship dysfunction, experiencing psychosis, the list goes on and on. Either all of us are accepted and seen as valuable, even when we're scary or smelly or unpleasant, or none of us are truly accepted. This comes with expanding our understanding of what socially appropriate behavior is. This doesn't mean that people aren't allowed to have limits or expectations for how others treat them, but we do need to push for society to question their notions of safety and unsafety. Is a person unsafe and frightening, or are they just moving in a way that looks unusual? Was this person being rude and verbally abusive, or were they just being autistic and blunt? The more tolerant we are of difference in our workplaces and in our culture, the fewer autistic people are going to end up fired, unhoused, incarcerated, and so on. We need a robust network of social supports and resources that will help carry autistic and other neurodivergent people throughout the lifespan. So you might get some early support with, let's say, some motor deficit issues or sensory issues as an autistic kid, but that care could carry all the way through into adulthood and perhaps involve social integration support. So, people that help you make friends or meet your social goals, that help you get out of the house. Perhaps a supportive person who will go with you to doctor's appointments or new social gatherings. Supportive decision making. So, an assigned or chosen person that can help you navigate deciding where to live or what to eat for dinner. Really integrating these kinds of supports throughout society so that autistic people who have some abilities and some disabilities are able to live the way they want to live and have the support in doing so. We need to really push for more interdependent family and educational networks so that no one family unit is solely responsible for managing their autistic kids' care, social integration, educational opportunities, and developing a future course of what their life is going to look like. It's very, very isolating right now for families, and that's part of why some autism families get preyed upon by radical anti-autistic groups and figures like RFK Jr. If instead a family was given a ton of resources and education and they were plugged into, here's some other autistic families, here's an autistic adult that you can talk to help you better understand your autistic kid. If that was how we greeted a family when one of their kids was diagnosed as autistic, instead of saying, there's something wrong with your child, here's all the treatment they're going to need forever, and you're on the hook for figuring it out. If instead of that we said, great news, your kid's different in a beautiful way. Here's some resources to understand that. Here's an autistic adult you can come to with questions. Here are the names and phone numbers of a couple of other autistic families in your community that you can get to know. And here's a roadmap for some of the ways that their life might look, regardless of whether or not they finish high school or they get a job. They can still have a worthwhile life with support. Then we would not see so many families treating autism as this horrific thing that needs to be cured or beaten out of someone, which is unfortunately still very much a cultural force. Finally, all of this is predicated on the idea that no human life is ever disposable. No matter how much support someone needs, no matter how ugly their coping strategies are, as a political movement, us neurodivergent folks really have to stand firmly in the idea that all life has meaning and dignity, that after a human being is born, they deserve to be given a chance at an education. They deserve to live in a home where they are not isolated or abused, where they can meet other people like them, where they can go where they want to go and wear what they want to wear and do what feels good in their bodies, feed themselves the foods that don't give them sensory meltdowns, and that they deserve that regardless of how independent they are or are not. When we really start from that premise, then we have a really firm political rooting to argue from, because then we are arguing for all humans who are marginalized, be that by race, other disability, mental health status, unhoused people, drug addicted people. Everyone that's treated as disposable is part of our greater community and can be part of this movement for advocacy and change and get us some of these resources that we all desperately need and just make this world a less cruel place. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation on this topic. I always like to hear from people about their thoughts and their own experiences of some of the changes that the autistic community has been experiencing in recent years. Here's some resources if you'd like to learn more. I write regularly about neurodiversity, identity, and a number of other issues at my Substack, drdevonprice.substack.com. All my writing is always free there. Autisticadvocacy.org is a wonderful set of resources, as I'm sure many of you know, the Autistic Self Advocacy Network. I'm a big fan of the blog Real Social Skills by Rabbi Rudy Reagan, which kind of just explodes and challenges the notion that to be socially skillful is to be polite and easy to deal with. And then there's a ton of books, some of which I've already mentioned. There's Unmasking Autism, which is my book that's really about and for the newly self realized and for autistic women, people of color, trans people, and other masked autistics who want to get more in touch with their genuine self. The follow up to that book is Unmasking for Life, which is my book that's all about, let's say that you get on board with the idea of unmasking. You accept yourself as an autistic person, but now that you've unmasked, that means your relationships are really different, your lifestyle's really different, how you live out your days and your habits might be really different, and you might not be able to work anymore. What does it mean to live a worthwhile life that accepts your disabilities and works with it rather than against it? So that's what that book is about and what it's kind of tailored for. The book Psychiatric Hegemony by Bruce Cohen is a wonderful review of the ways in which institutional psychiatry has sometimes been used to oppress and limit members of our community. Anand Prahlad's book, The Secret Life of a Black Aspie, is an amazing, really evocative and poetic personal story of being a Black autistic queer person in the mid 20th century in the United States, and then discovering that they were autistic later in life. Laura Kate Dale's Uncomfortable Labels is a great story about being an autistic trans woman who's also a lesbian and some of the experiences of masking that involves. It turns out a lot of trans women have a really powerful experience of not being seen as autistic when they were young and having to mask their traits. So hearing about her experiences is also really important. Empire of Normality by Robert Chapman is really a questioning of the dogma that people be normal in society. And it really looks at how capitalism and oppressive social forces have created this idea of the normal way of being and why it's so damaging to folks. And then finally, We're Not Broken by my friend and colleague Eric Garcia. He's an autistic writer for The Independent, and he went across America interviewing different autistic people about how they live and what they need. The full spectrum from non-speaking, high support needing autistics to people like me and him who can speak and write and mask as non-autistic fairly well, and really talking about politically what we need to see to be able to move forward. And Eric's working on an amazing book about autism and masculinity that people should check out soon too. I'm really excited to see it when it comes out. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening and for being here and for being part of the future of neurodiversity as a conversation and as a community. As always, I welcome hearing people's thoughts about this stuff and their own experience of it. You can find me on my Substack, drdevonprice.substack.com. And thank you again so much for having me be a part of this event. It's really an honor.